Nebraska, 1996. Before the sun had even fully climbed above the flat, windswept horizon, Lone Creek Ranch already looked like a sketch carved out of dust and stubbornness. The prairie stretched endlessly in every direction, a wide, untamed sweep of dry grasses, swaying under the push of a cold dawn wind. The sky held that pale, silver-blue glow that comes just before morning truly breaks, a soft warning that another long day on the frontier was about to begin. Luke Benson had been awake for hours, he always was. The young rancher, only 25, but shaped by grief into something quieter, older, moved across his yard with a steady, practiced gait. The boards of the old barn complained under his boots. His breath rose in faint clouds as he checked the latches, tightened a rope, and tossed feed to the restless horses waiting in their stalls. This land was all he had left. The ranch, the barn, the tiny wooden house. It was the last piece of his mother, the last thing his father hadn't managed to run from before disappearing into the world without a word. Luke learned early that out here, men either stayed and fought for a life or drifted away like loose tumbleweed. His father chose the latter. And when the woman Luke once loved walked away a year ago, leaving only a note and a cold ache in his chest, he'd decided he wouldn't open himself again. Not to hope, not to heartbreak, not to anything. Life was simpler that way. Sunrise, chores, the restless wind, and silence. He was inside pouring the morning's first tin cup of bitter coffee when it happened. A knock, soft, uncertain, echoed against his front door. Luke froze. No one ever came this early. No one ever came at all unless they needed a tool or wanted to borrow a horse. His hand paused above the coffee tin, every instinct sharpening like a blade. The knock came again, light, hesitant, almost fragile. He set the tin aside and crossed the creaking floorboards, his boots heavy in the stillness. When he pulled open the door, the cold morning air rushed in, and with it, a sight that rooted him to the spot. A young Apache woman stood beneath the slanted porch roof, her slender frame wrapped in a worn deer-hide dress that had seen too many storms. The edges were frayed, darkened by travel and weather. Her long black hair was braided tightly down her back, decorated with a single white feather that fluttered in the wind like a trembling heartbeat. Her skin carried that warm, sun-touched tone of the southern plains, but her face was pale with exhaustion, and her eyes, dark, brilliant, and unsteady, met his with a mixture of fear, resolve, and something painfully fragile. It was Nuna, the very same woman he'd thought about more than he cared to admit since the night he had found her half-frozen near the creek weeks ago. The night he carried her into his home, the night they shared something born out of vulnerability and storm-battered loneliness. A night neither of them had spoken of again. Seeing her now, trembling beneath his porch, hit him with a force he couldn't name. "Nuna," he murmured, voice low, wary. "You're out here before sunrise. What happened?" She didn't step inside. She didn't smile. She didn't even greet him. Instead, her hands clutched tightly onto the fur-lined shawl around her shoulders, knuckles pale. "I had nowhere else to go," she whispered, her voice raw from wind or tears. He couldn't tell which. Luke exhaled slowly, trying to understand, trying to steady himself against the sudden pressure blooming in his chest. He opened the door wider. Come in, you're freezing." But she shook her head. Her chin lifted, though her eyes were glossy with uncertainty. The wind pressed against her, carrying strands of hair across her face, but she didn't move to brush them away. She only stared at him, deep, unwavering, heart heavy, as if bracing herself to speak words that would change everything between them. "Luke Benson," she finally said, her voice quiet but unwavering. He swallowed, suddenly aware of how still the world had become. Even the prairie wind seemed to hush. Nuna took a trembling breath. "I must tell you something," she said, fingers tightening on her shawl. "Something that cannot wait." Luke felt his pulse thrum painfully in his chest. Her next words fell like a hammer blow to the quiet morning. "The child I carried, it belongs to you." Those words hung between them like smoke from a pistol shot. The prairie, the wind, the waking world. All of it seemed to fall away. Only Nuna remained, standing small and strong beneath his porch, her confession trembling in the cold dawn as if the earth itself held its breath. Luke's world, already fragile, already cracked, splintered again. It had been one of the harshest nights of the winter. Wind howled like wounded wolves across the prairie, tearing through the cottonwoods along Lone Creek. Snow fell sideways, sharp as broken glass under the lantern light. Luke had been out searching for a missing calf, a stubborn little thing that often wandered farther than it should. He remembered cursing under his breath as he trudged through knee-high drifts, the lantern flickering wildly in his gloved hand. Visibility was poor, the world erased in sheets of white. He had nearly turned back when he spotted something unusual near the frozen creek. A shape collapsed in the snow, delicate and unmoving. At first he thought it was an animal. Then he saw the braid, long, black, and stiff with frost. "Hey!" he whispered into the storm. He didn't yet know her name. He dropped to his knees beside her. Her skin was ice cold, her breath shallow and faint. She wore a thin deer-hide dress not meant for this brutal cold. Her legs scratched, her face streaked with exhaustion and snowmelt. And across her back, faint cuts, bruises, the marks of running. Tracks behind her told the rest of the story. Boot prints, heavy and chaotic, belonging to men. Men who hunted what wasn't theirs to hunt. Sons of hell. Luke didn't waste another second. He wrapped her in his coat, lifted her into his arms, and carried her back to the ranch against the screaming wind. She weighed almost nothing, like a fragile bird half frozen in a storm. Inside his home, he built a fire so fierce it cracked the wood. He laid Nuna near the hearth, rubbing her hands to bring color back into them. He fed her warm broth, drop by drop, until she could swallow on her own. When she finally woke, her eyes flickered open. Dark, alert, frightened. But she didn't try to run. She simply whispered, voice soft and raw, "You saved me." She stayed on the floor near the fire that night, wrapped in Luke's blanket, drinking the broth he made from his last piece of venison. The storm raged outside, hurling fistfuls of snow against the shutters. But in the glow of the flames, something quieter, heavier settled over the small room. They were two strangers, yet somehow cut from the same loneliness. As the night deepened, Nuna began to speak, slowly, cautiously, as if each word cost her a piece of strength. She told him how her band of the tribe had scattered after soldiers raided their camp months ago. She told him how she lived like a shadow along the ridges, hunted by men who wanted to claim or sell her. How she had lost family, friends, every piece of the world she knew. She wasn't crying. Nuna didn't seem like someone who cried easily, but there was a broken, drifting quality to her voice, a wandering soul forced to survive in a world that had no place for her. Luke sat across from her, boots off, hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee gone cold. And in the dim, ember-colored light, he spoke too, about a boy who used to wait by a window for a father who never returned, about a mother who worked herself into sickness trying to hold a ranch together, about the fear that one day he'd become the same kind of man who walked away. Nuna listened, really listened, like no one had in years. In the heart of a vicious snowstorm, two lonely people found the courage to say the things they didn't dare admit under the sun. And then there was quiet, a long, trembling quiet in which the wind outside seemed to fade, leaving only the soft crackle of the fire and the heavy truth that they both were tired of being alone. What happened next was not planned, not spoken, not even fully understood by either of them. But it was real, a moment of warmth in a world of cold. At dawn, the storm finally surrendered. Nuna rose before Luke did. She gathered her things such as they were and left the ranch without waking him. She did not leave a message, did not promise to return. Luke found only a small feather near the hearth, a single white feather from her braid. He pocketed it and spent the next month pretending the night had meant nothing. But now, standing in the doorway with Nuna shivering before him, her words echoing in the pale light of morning, "The child I carried, it belongs to you." The pretending was over, because destiny, relentless as the prairie wind, had come knocking again. For a long, breathless moment after Nuna's confession, Luke didn't say a word. The wind pushed across the porch, rattling the loose board near his boot, but he hardly heard it. His heartbeat drowned out everything else. Steady at first, then fierce, then unsteady like a spooked horse. Her words, "The child I carry belongs to you." He tried to swallow, but his throat tightened. He gripped the doorframe to steady himself. "Nuna," he whispered, though he didn't know what was supposed to follow that name. He wasn't angry, wasn't even doubtful, just terrified. A deep, choking, bone-deep terror. The kind that grabbed him by the ribs and squeezed until he felt hollow. Inside, everything was chaos. Tangled thoughts, memories, fears that clawed up from places he thought he'd buried. The frontier demanded strong men, responsible men, men who knew their place and built something out of it. He wasn't sure he was any of those things. He thought of the town, how folks in Lone Creek barely tolerated outsiders, let alone an Apache woman carrying a rancher's child. He imagined the stares, the whispers, the judgment. They'd call him foolish, reckless, shameful, maybe worse. But none of that scared him as much as the thought that he might fail the child the way his father had failed him. He could already hear his father's voice, faint, shadowy, saying, "You're not cut out for this, son." Luke stepped back from the doorway, rubbing a shaking hand over his face. Nuna misread the gesture. Her expression shifted, quiet, resigned, the way someone looks when they have already prepared for rejection. "I understand," she murmured, voice barely more than air. "This is not your burden. I came only to tell you the truth. Nothing more." Nuna, wait. But she had already turned away from him, tightening the shawl around her shoulders as if bracing for another storm. The prairie wind tugged at her braids as she stepped off the porch. Her figure looked even smaller against the rolling golden grass that stretched into the distance. Luke watched her descend the short steps, each footfall delicate but determined. She wasn't angry, wasn't pleading, wasn't demanding anything, and somehow that hurt worse. "Nuna, where are you going?" His voice cracked. "Far," she said without looking back. "Someplace the hunters won't find me, and where no one will trouble you because of me." A fierce gust swept across the land, flattening the tall grass as she kept walking. Her steps were steady but heavy, like someone carrying more than one kind of weight. Luke's chest tightened painfully. "You don't have to do this," he said. "I do," she replied. "A child deserves a safe beginning. I cannot offer that if I stay near your ranch. People will talk. They will judge. They may try to hurt you, or the child. I will not bring you that kind of trouble." Her voice wavered only at the end, a barely audible tremor. Then she straightened her shoulders. "I will not trap you in this." Luke took one step forward, then stopped. For a moment, he let fear dictate his silence. That same old fear that had controlled him since boyhood. The fear of not being enough, of messing things up, of becoming a mirror image of the man who'd walked out on his family without so much as a goodbye. And as he watched Nuna walk away again, this time with his child, something inside him finally snapped. "Nuna!" he shouted. She stopped halfway down the path leading toward the open prairie. Slowly she turned. Her eyes met his, dark, guarded, waiting for the final blow. Luke's boots pounded across the porch boards as he closed the distance between them. The cold air stung his face, but he didn't slow. When he reached her, his breath was rough, uneven. He stood there for a heartbeat, staring at her with a clarity he hadn't felt since he was a boy. "If the child is mine," he said, voice firm despite the tremble in it, "then I will take responsibility." Nuna blinked, startled. Luke continued, more certain with each word. "I know what it's like to be abandoned. I lived through that, and I swore I'd never do that to anyone, let alone a child." He swallowed hard. "And I damn sure won't do it to you." Wind lifted the ends of her shawl as her eyes widened, not with fear this time, but with disbelief, and something softer beneath it. Luke reached up, hesitant, almost fragile, and placed a hand lightly on her arm. "You're not alone in this," he said. "Not anymore." For the first time since dawn broke, Nuna's breath caught, not from cold, but from a shift she hadn't expected. Luke Benson, the man who lived behind walls, had just shattered one of them. A quiet, trembling truth settled between them. This wasn't just about a child. It was about a man finally choosing who he wanted to become. And destiny, relentless as the prairie wind, carried them both into the unknown. Luke never imagined that a single decision, spoken out there on the windy path with Nuna staring at him in disbelief, would reshape the quiet routine of Lone Creek Ranch. But once the words had left his mouth, once he committed himself to standing beside her, there was no turning back. Not for him, not for her, not for the child she carried. The very next morning, Luke began building. He started with a small shelter behind the barn. Nothing grand, nothing polished, just a sturdy little one-room lean-to made of rough-cut pine and salvage boards. The smell of sawdust clung to him all afternoon as he hammered, sawed, cursed under his breath, and rebuilt the corners twice when the wind blew them crooked. Nuna watched quietly from a distance at first, unsure whether to help or stay out of his way. She wasn't used to relying on anyone. She'd spent too many nights sleeping under trees, too many mornings waking to danger, too many days reminding herself that survival depended only on her. But Luke didn't let her feel like a stranger. When the shelter was finally standing, he carried over blankets, soft wool ones that had belonged to his mother. Then came a jug of clean water, a tin of dried venison, some cornbread wrapped in cloth, and a lantern with enough oil to last several nights. "Wind gets cold out here," he said, placing the blankets inside. "You'll sleep warmer if you keep the lantern low." Nuna nodded, her eyes following the lantern's glow like it held something precious. "Thank you," she whispered. Those two words carried a sincerity that hit Luke harder than he expected. Over the next few days, he taught her the routines of ranch life, how to work the old wood stove, how to reinforce the fence rails after a storm, how to brush down a horse and check its hooves for stones. Nuna absorbed everything, quick, focused, and surprisingly graceful in her movements. She seemed almost relieved to have something steady to hold on to. But stability was not something their world offered easily. Word traveled fast in Lone Creek. Too fast. By the end of the first week, every man leaning on a hitching post, every woman buying flour at the general store, every ranch hand hauling hay seemed to know that Luke Benson was housing an Apache woman on his land. Whispers followed them whenever Luke rode into town for supplies. "Benson's lost his damn mind. She'll bring trouble." Boys throwing his life away on an Indian girl. Most of the time, Luke ignored it. He'd grown thick skin after years of being judged for his father's disappearance. But Nuna wasn't used to the eyes, the stares, the ugly muttering. And each time someone spat a word her way, she grew quieter, her posture tightening like a bowstring pulled too taut. Then came the night trouble finally stepped out of the shadows. Luke had taken Nuna into town to trade for flour and medicine. On the way back, 3 cowboys, already staggering from whiskey, blocked their path near the hitching rail. One smirked. "Well now, Benson's got himself a wild prize." Another reached for Nuna's braid. Luke grabbed the man's wrist before fingers could touch hair. "Take your hand away," Luke said, voice low, dangerous. The man scoffed. "You protecting her now?" Luke didn't answer with words. He squeezed harder. The man yelped and stumbled back, cursing. The others looked ready to swing at Luke. But something in his posture, solid, unwavering, cold as a winter creek, made them reconsider. "Let's go," one muttered. And like that, they slunk away into the darkness. Nuna said nothing for a long moment after they left, but she looked at Luke differently, as if realizing he hadn't just made promises. He meant them. Back at the ranch, the nights grew colder. The two of them spent evenings sitting by a small campfire between the house and Nuna's shelter, letting the flames crackle against the vast prairie silence. These quiet moments were where their connection began to take root. Not through touch, not through obligation, but through shared truths. Nuna spoke first most nights. She told him about the mountains where she was born, about pine trees so tall they scraped the sky, about the chants her people sang at dawn to greet the spirits of their ancestors. She described freedom the way a poet describes wind, untamed, sacred, necessary. Luke listened with an earnestness he didn't show anyone else. And gradually he opened up too. He told her about growing up alone on the ranch, about wanting a family more than land or cattle, about the way he'd always feared disappointing someone the way his father had disappointed him. "I always thought I wasn't built for all this," he said one night, staring into the flames. Nuna's eyes softened. "You are more capable than you think," she replied. The fire popped, bright sparks rising into the night sky. And somewhere in the space between them, between fear and hope, between past and future, something fragile yet steady began to form. But a bond strong enough to weather the coming storms. The days that followed settled into a rough, uncertain rhythm. One shaped by Nuna's changing body and Luke's clumsy attempts to meet needs he barely understood. Spring winds blew across the open prairie, carrying dust, pollen, and the sharp scent of sagebrush. But inside Lone Creek Ranch, another kind of shift was unfolding. A quieter one, a more personal one. Luke noticed it first in small ways. Nuna moved slower. Her breaths came shorter. And some mornings, she doubled over outside her shelter, one hand braced against the wooden frame as nausea took hold. He didn't know a damn thing about pregnancy, but he knew exhaustion when he saw it. So Luke did what he could. He learned how to steam corn and mash it into a soft porridge his mother used to make when he was sick. He cooked stew with beans, onions, and whatever rabbit he could catch. He brought water warm by the stove so Nuna didn't have to ride to the creek. And when she shivered too hard from the morning chill, he laid extra blankets inside her shelter, quietly before she woke. When porridge wasn't enough, he tried herbs. At first, he had no idea what he was doing. He burned his fingers 3 times trying to keep the kettle balanced over the fire pit. He ruined a perfectly good shirt sleeve, waving off the smoke when the herbs fumed too much. But he kept trying. Eventually, he snuck into town and asked old Margaret, the widow who ran a small herb shop, for remedies. Luke avoided saying who they were for, but Margaret's eyes were sharp. "You making tea for an Apache girl?" she asked plainly. Luke stiffened. Maybe. "You'll want wild mint and ginger root," Margaret said, pushing the herbs across the counter. "And patience. Lots of patience." That night, he brewed the tea carefully, following Margaret's instructions until the sharp, minty smell filled the small space between their shelters. But he didn't stop there. Nuna often mentioned Apache methods of warming a home, using heated stones wrapped in cloth to keep the cold off the belly. Luke tried it himself. The first stone cracked, the second burned a hole in his glove, the third finally worked. He said it beside her with a shy, awkward drop of his voice. Thought it might help. Nuna looked at the stone, then at him, and though she said nothing, something softened around her eyes, but the tenderness didn't last. One afternoon, Nuna tried standing to help him patch the barn roof. She barely got 2 steps before dizziness swept over her. Luke reached for her, steadying her arm. "You shouldn't be lifting anything," he said gently. "You need rest." Nuna jerked her arm away, teeth clenched. "I am not weak," she snapped. "I can survive alone. I have survived alone. You do not need to look after me like I am helpless." Luke blinked at her, surprised not by the anger but by the raw ache hiding behind it. "I never said you were helpless," he replied. "You treat me like I am," she shot back. "As if carrying this child makes me less. As if being here makes me a burden." Luke felt something twist inside him. "You're not a burden." Nuna's voice rose with frustration. "I have lived without anyone for years. I can still do it. I don't want pity, Luke Benson." He stepped closer, steady but firm. "It ain't pity," he said. "You're not alone anymore." That was when her face changed. The fury drained from her features as quickly as it had appeared. Her breath stuttered. Her eyes flickered away. Not in anger this time, but in fear. A trembling, vulnerable kind of fear. A long silence stretched before Nuna finally whispered, almost choking on the words, "I don't want to ruin your life." Her voice cracked at the end. A small, heartbreaking sound that didn't belong to someone as strong as her. She pressed a hand to her mouth, fighting emotions she had buried for far too long. And then, for the first time since Luke had known her, Nuna cried. Not loud, not messy, just quiet, trembling tears that slid down her sun-kissed cheeks, leaving dark tracks behind. Luke's chest tightened painfully. He had no fancy words, no preacher wisdom, just instinct. He lifted a hand, slow, hesitant, and rested it on her shoulder. His thumb brushed lightly against her collarbone. "You didn't break anything in my life, Nuna," he murmured. "You saved me from emptiness." She looked up sharply, eyes glossy and disbelieving. Luke held her gaze, voice steady as a promise. "I mean it. You didn't wreck my world. You gave it direction." Nuna swallowed hard, then let her forehead rest, just barely against his chest. And for Luke, that was enough to begin feeling something new stirring inside him. Quiet, fierce, instinctive. Something like the first heartbeat of a father. The prairie had a way of warning Luke before trouble came. Subtle shifts in the wind, the restless twitch of a horse's ear, the uneasy silence of morning birds. But on the day Iha arrived, there was no warning. Only a sudden tension in the air, sharp and electric, that made Luke step away from chopping firewood and look toward the northern fence. That was when he saw her. A woman stood just beyond the barbed wire, motionless as a carved statue. Her hair, long, black, streaked with silver, hung in tight braids. Her dress was worn buckskin, decorated with beadwork faded by time. A deep scar ran from her temple to her jaw, an old wound that hadn't softened with the years. But it was her eyes that struck him hardest, sharp, hawk-like, unwavering. Eyes that looked at him as if she had already judged him guilty. Nuna stepped out of her shelter a heartbeat later, and her breath caught. Aha, she whispered. Her mother. Iha didn't greet her daughter, didn't smile. She only lifted a hand, two fingers raised in a gesture of acknowledgement, then pointed toward Luke as if gesturing at something foul. "Who is that man?" she demanded in Apache before switching to rough English. "Why are you here with him?" Her voice cracked like a whip, harsh, commanding, brimming with old pain. Nuna moved closer to her mother. "We should go inside." "No." Ia's gaze cut like a blade. "Speak here." Luke felt the hostility roll off her in waves. He'd faced angry ranchers, drunk cowboys, and a handful of wolves in his lifetime. But nothing felt quite like standing under Aha's stare. She watched him with the fierce intensity of a mother bear guarding her last surviving cub. Nuna swallowed, hands trembling slightly. "I stayed because I am not alone now." Aha's jaw tensed. "Do not tell me this rancher forced you, or tricked you, or—" "No," Nuna blurted out, voice tight. "It wasn't like that." But the hesitation, the faint, fearful tremor, did not escape Aha's sharp eyes. She stepped closer, her face inches from her daughter's, searching for truth in every breath. "You carry a child," Aha said quietly. "Tell me whose it is." Nuna closed her eyes, steadying herself. "It is his," she whispered. The wind howled across the prairie at that exact moment, almost as if the land itself recoiled. Aha stiffened. Rage flared in her eyes, bright and dangerous. "You let him touch you?" she snarled. "A man not of our blood? A man from a people who took everything from us? Mama, you should have run. You should have fought. You should have died before letting this happen." Her words struck Nuna like arrows. Luke saw her flinch, her shoulders tighten, her breath waver. He took a slow step forward. "That's enough," he said quietly. Aha whirled on him, fury blazing. "You have no right to speak." Luke didn't lift his hands or raise his voice. "Maybe not, but I'm not letting you tear her apart." Aha stalked toward him until they were only a few feet apart. Up close, Luke could see the years carved into her face. The grief, the battles, the losses that hardened her into someone unyielding. "You stole my daughter's honor," she hissed. "You used her weakness to get what you wanted. Men like you have done it for generations." Luke didn't back up, didn't defend himself with excuses. His voice came low, steady, almost gentle. "I didn't take anything from her." Aha's nostrils flared. Luke continued. "I didn't force her. I didn't trick her. And I sure as hell didn't abandon her. I only want to protect her. And the child." She stared at him, searching for cracks, searching for lies. Luke held her gaze, unflinching, honest, raw. "I'm trying to build a family," he said, "not break one." The words hung between them, heavy as storm clouds gathering on the plains. Aha's anger didn't vanish. It shifted. The fire in her eyes dimmed, replaced by something more difficult to read. Grief, maybe. Fear. Weariness. She looked back at Nuna, who stood with hands clasped over her belly, breathing shaky but determined. After a long, suffocating silence, Aha straightened her spine and spoke. "I will stay." Nuna exhaled in relief, but Aha wasn't finished. "I will watch," she said, turning to Luke. "Every word you say, every choice you make. If you lie, if you harm her, if your heart fails." She leaned in, her voice a low, lethal whisper. "I will know." Then she stepped back, planting her spear into the earth beside her like a warning stake. Luke met her eyes without flinching. "Fair enough." For the first time, something faint, almost like reluctant respect, flickered across Aha's expression. And though the air was still tense, still heavy with unspoken distrust, something else pulsed beneath it. A sliver of possibility, a fragile beginning, hope, rough-edged but real, taking root on Lone Creek Ranch. The presence of Aha brought tension to Lone Creek Ranch, but it also forced Luke and Nuna into a rhythm that felt surprisingly natural. A quiet, steady rhythm that loosened the knot of uncertainty between them. Days grew warmer, grass shooting higher across the prairie, and life settled into something almost peaceful. Almost. Luke had always worked alone, fixing fences, chopping wood, tending horses, hunting small game to fill the pantry. But now he found himself moving through the ranch with someone at his shoulder. Someone who didn't complain about the long hours or the dust or the endless list of chores Western life demanded. Nuna, she learned quickly. That much didn't surprise him. But what did surprise him was how naturally she fit into the flow of his days, as if her presence filled empty spaces he hadn't realized were hollow. They hunted together early in the mornings. Nuna carried her handmade bow, moving silently through the tall grass with a hunter's grace. Luke followed behind with his rifle slung across his shoulder, watching how she read the land. Tracks, broken twigs, shifts in wind. When she knelt beside a rabbit snare she'd set the night before, she worked with a quiet confidence that Luke couldn't help admiring. "You're better at this than I am," he said one morning. She glanced up, a flash of pride crossing her face. "My father taught me when I was small." Luke nodded. "Well, your father did good." Later in the day, when they braided rawhide into ropes, Nuna showed him a knot he'd never seen before. One she said her people used to bind shelters during storms. He liked the way her hands moved, steady, skilled, purposeful. Even Iha, though always watchful, offered her herbal knowledge when Nuna felt tired. Luke paid attention, learned the herbs by scent and shape, wanting to understand anything that could make Nuna's days easier. And in return, he taught her things too. He taught her to ride a horse properly, how to sit tall, how to grip with her knees, how to shift her weight when the horse climbed or descended. Nuna took to it fast. The first time she rode alone across the pasture, hair whipping behind her, Luke felt something tighten in his chest, a strange mix of pride and protectiveness. He also taught her how to swing a rope and read the wind, a skill every rancher needed. Her first attempt sent the rope smacking into her own shoulder. Luke laughed, earning a sharp glare from Nuna, but the glare softened into reluctant amusement. "You are not a very patient teacher," she muttered. "And you're not very patient, period," Luke shot back. She tried again, and again, until the loop sailed clean and true. Luke couldn't remember the last time he'd smiled that much. It wasn't the chores or the lessons that changed things between them. It was the in-between moments, the small, accidental pieces of life that stitched themselves into something deeper. One afternoon, Luke tripped on a loose board and fell straight into a pile of hay. It wasn't a dangerous fall, just awkward, clumsy, wholly undignified. For a split second, he wondered if Nuna would rush to help. She didn't. Instead, she burst out laughing, a bright, melodic laugh that caught him completely off guard. It filled the barn like warm sunlight, and Luke found himself laughing too, even as hay clung to his hair and shirt. It was the first time he'd heard her laugh. It wouldn't be the last. On another evening, as the sun dipped low across the prairie, they sat on the porch working on something new, a wooden ring for the baby. Luke carved the smooth edges. Nuna wrapped it in soft leather strips dyed with crushed berries. Their hands brushed more than once, but neither pulled away. "Babies in my tribe hold these," Nuna said quietly. "It's a reminder that the world is wide, but they are safe." Luke traced the carving he'd made, a tiny sprig of sage. "Then ours will have the same." She didn't correct him for saying ours. That small silence meant more than any spoken word. And soon they stopped addressing one another with the stiff caution of strangers. Nuna became you, spoken softer, almost warm. Luke became something she said without hesitation, without flinching. Something familiar. They did not speak of love. They did not call themselves a couple. They did not define what was happening. But the truth wove itself into the days and nights with undeniable clarity. When Luke reached for tools, Nuna was already handing him the right one. When Nuna winced from a cramp, Luke was already fetching warm stones or tea. When they sat by the fire, words came easier. Stories, confessions, quiet hopes neither had dared to voice before. They still slept in separate shelters, still held their distance in the ways that mattered. But their lives were no longer separate. And without ever naming it, both of them understood. The ranch wasn't just shelter anymore. It was becoming something else, something neither had expected. Something like home. The prairie has a long memory, and so do the men who drink too much and forget too little. By late summer, the tension in Lone Creek Town had grown thicker than the dust hanging in the air. Folks pretended not to stare when Luke and Nuna rode in for supplies, but whispers always followed them like shadows clinging to their boots. And behind most of those whispers was one name, Dunn Keller. Dunn had always been trouble. Loud when drunk, mean when sober, and bitter enough to sour a barrel of whiskey. He'd taken a liking to Nuna the very first time he saw her months ago, long before she ever told Luke she was carrying his child. Dunn liked to circle what he thought belonged to no one, believing all things in the West could be claimed if a man reached fast enough. But Nuna had refused him with a cold, steady stare. And Dunn wasn't a man who handled rejection well. One sweltering afternoon, Dunn staggered into town again, drunker than a rattlesnake in heat, bragging to anyone who would listen. Luke Benson's got himself an Indian girl tucked out on that ranch, he slurred loudly. Feeds her, keeps her, uses her, like some damn wild pet. Some laughed, some looked away, some believed it. Rumors spread like prairie fire. By the time Dunn finished his fifth drink, he convinced himself that Nuna still owed him attention, and with an angry swagger, he headed toward Lone Creek Ranch. Toward Nuna, trouble riding beside him like a loyal companion. Nuna was by the water trough when he arrived, filling a pail for Aha's evening wash. Her back was turned. Her braids swayed gently in the warm breeze. Dunn slid off his horse, stumbling toward her with the sly grin of a man who thought the world owed him something. Well now, he drawled, ain't you a sight? Nuna stiffened instantly. She set the pail down slowly, but her body tensed like a deer sensing a hunter. I do not wish to speak with you, she said firmly. Dunn stepped closer, his breath thick with alcohol. I ain't asking what you wish. His hand shot out, grabbing her arm. Nuna jerked away, but Dunn gripped tighter, his fingers digging into her skin. Before she could pull free, get your hands off her. The voice cut through the air like a crack of thunder. Luke. He was running toward them, dust flying behind him, boots slamming against the ground with furious purpose. Dunn didn't let go. I'm just saying hello. Luke's fist connected with Dunn's jaw before the sentence finished. Dunn went crashing backward into the dirt. Dunn scrambled to his feet, spitting blood and fury. You think you can take her from me? Luke didn't answer. He didn't need to. They crashed into each other, fists flying, bodies slamming against the trough, dirt kicking beneath their boots. Dunn fought dirty, swinging wild and mean. Luke fought with something else entirely, something deeper, protective, burning like a wildfire at his core. Dunn managed to cut Luke's cheek with a ringed knuckle. Luke barely flinched. He grabbed Dunn by the collar and slammed him against the fence. But just as Luke pulled back for a final, punishing blow, Nuna stepped between them, her hands pressed against Luke's chest, her voice trembling. Luke, stop! He froze, breath ragged, chest heaving beneath her palms. If you bleed for me, she whispered, eyes fierce and frightened, I cannot live with that weight. I cannot be the reason you ruin yourself. Luke stared at her, really stared, and something inside him broke open. He wasn't fighting Dunn to prove he was a man. He wasn't fighting for pride or reputation or to quiet rumors. He was fighting because Nuna mattered, because the life inside her mattered, because this ranch, this fragile thing they were building, mattered. Slowly, Luke released Dunn's shirt. Dunn collapsed to the ground, coughing, angry and humiliated. Luke didn't even look at him. Get off my land, Luke said quietly. Dunn glared up at him, but something in Luke's eyes made even a drunk man see reason. Dunn shuffled to his horse, climbed up with difficulty and rode away, cursing under his breath. The prairie swallowed him whole. Nuna turned toward Luke. Her hands were still trembling, her breath uneven. But there was something else in her gaze. Gratitude, fear, and a quiet, blooming affection she hadn't meant to reveal. You should not risk your life for me, she whispered. Luke wiped the blood from his cheek and gave a small, tired smile. I wasn't risking it, he said softly. I was protecting what's mine. Nuna's breath hitched. She didn't argue. She didn't correct him. She simply looked at him as if seeing him in a new light. Stronger, steadier, and more hers than either of them had been ready to admit. And in that moment, Luke knew. He wasn't fighting for honor. He was fighting for family. Storms on the prairie didn't give warnings. They came roaring out of nowhere, wild and unforgiving. That night, thunder cracked open the sky like a rifle shot, and rain hammered the ranch roof in furious sheets. Luke woke to a sound he'd never heard from Nuna before. A sharp, breathless gasp of pain. He bolted upright, heart slamming in his chest, and sprinted toward her shelter. Lightning split the clouds overhead, lighting the yard in flashes of blue-white. The wind was brutal, tossing dust and water everywhere. Nuna, he shouted, pushing through the door. She was on her knees, one arm wrapped around her belly, the other braced against the wooden wall. Her face was pale, slick with sweat. Another wave of pain struck, and she cried out, a raw, helpless sound that tore at Luke's insides. It's time, she gasped. The baby, she's coming. Luke had no training, no doctor, no midwife, no steady hands taught for this kind of miracle. He only had instinct, and that instinct roared inside him louder than any thunder. He lifted Nuna carefully, guiding her toward the main cabin while the storm clawed at the windows. Iha appeared like a shadow out of the rain, her braided hair soaked, her face set in fierce determination. "She cannot ride to town," Iha said. "The child will come now." Luke nodded sharply. "Then we bring the world to her." He stoked the stove until it glowed red hot, the warmth fighting against the cold storm air leaking through the cabin walls. He boiled water, fumbling with the kettle, nearly dropping it when Nuna screamed again. Her cries weren't quiet. They were primal, desperate, pulled from the deepest place inside her. Luke grabbed towels, old ones, frayed but clean, and laid them at the foot of the bed. He placed his hand in hers, letting her squeeze until his bones ached. "I'm here," he whispered. "I'm right here." Iha knelt beside her daughter, pressing firm, steady hands against her shoulders. "Breathe," Iha commanded. "Stay with us, Nuna." Lightning struck so close the entire cabin shook. Nuna cried out again, a long, trembling howl that echoed through every board of the ranch house. Luke leaned closer, brushing hair from her face with shaking hands. "You're doing good. You're strong. Stronger than anyone I've ever known." Her breath hitched between contractions. "It hurts." "I know," Luke said, "but you're not alone." His voice cracked on the last word. Minutes stretched into something that felt like hours. The storm outside raged wildly, but all Luke could hear was Nuna, her shallow breaths, her exhausted sobs, her desperate grip on his hand. Then Aya's voice shifted, quieter, sharper. "It's time, push." Nuna screamed, body tensing with everything she had. The wind howled, rattling the shutters. Luke felt his heart break for her, for the pain she carried alone until now. "One more," Iha urged. And then, Durin. A small, piercing cry rose above the thunder, a cry that cut through the storm like sunlight through clouds. Luke's breath stopped. Nuna collapsed back against the pillows, tears slipping from her closed eyes. Tears of exhaustion, relief, and something indescribably beautiful. Iha lifted the tiny squirming baby girl, swaddled her in a warm cloth, and placed her in Nuna's trembling arms. "She is strong," Iha whispered, "a warrior spirit." Luke stepped closer, barely able to breathe. The baby blinked up at him with wide, dark eyes, soft, innocent, and unmistakably his. Eyes shaped like Nuna's, colored like his own. He sank to his knees beside them. "My God," he breathed, "she's perfect." Nuna, exhausted but glowing with a fragile smile, looked at him. "She has your eyes," she whispered. Luke brushed a trembling finger along the baby's tiny hand. "And your courage." Rain pounded the roof in one final roar before the storm softened into a gentle whisper. Inside the warm cabin, Luke and Nuna sat together, wrapped around the new life between them. Nuna looked down at the child, her voice low, tender. "Her name," she said softly, "will be Lily." Luke lifted his gaze. "Lily!" "It is the flower that grows by the creek," Nuna whispered. "The place you found me, the place that saved us both." Luke didn't trust his voice. He leaned forward, pressing his forehead gently against Nuna's. Then he wrapped his arms around both of them, mother and daughter, pulling them close as his eyes burned with tears he didn't bother hiding. "Welcome home, Lily," he whispered. Outside, the storm faded. Inside Lone Creek Ranch, a family, unexpected, unlikely, but deeply real, took its first breath. Spring came slow to the prairie, creeping in one warm breeze at a time, melting the last edges of winter off the hills. The ranch, once quiet and hollow, now breathed with new life. Nuna healed steadily, her strength returning day by day. The shadows that once clung to her eyes faded, replaced with something softer. Confidence, serenity, in the quiet pride of motherhood. And Lily. Lily filled every corner of Lone Creek Ranch with the kind of sound that could mend a tired man's heart. Her laughter rang across the yard, small and bright as wind chimes. She'd reach for Luke every time he walked past, tiny fingers stretching with certainty, as though she had always known he'd come. Iha settled in like she had always been part of this land. She planted rows of herbs along the south side of the cabin, humming old Apache melodies while the sun warmed her back. She tended to Lily with a grandmother's patience, and the baby responded with happy coos, already recognizing safety in her arms. In a place once shaped by silence, three voices now made a home. Luke wasn't the same rancher who once ate alone at a long table meant for many. He wasn't that lonely boy who grew up believing every good thing he touched would eventually slip away. He had crossed a line he never saw coming. He had become a man who stayed. A man who carried responsibility without fear. A man who didn't let storms, past or present, chase him off his own land. A man who understood that love, real love, wasn't loud. It was steady, unbreakable, earned. Every morning he'd wake to Lily babbling softly beside the hearth. Every evening he'd find Nuna watching the horizon, the last golden light touching her cheek. And somewhere in between, he realized he wasn't running anymore. Not from his childhood, not from loneliness, not from the thought of losing someone. He was finally standing still and standing strong. One quiet afternoon, while the sun dipped low and warm across the pasture, Nuna approached him. Lily slept against her chest, wrapped in a soft cloth Aha had woven. The baby's tiny hand curled gently in Nuna's braid. Nuna's voice was low, almost hesitant, carrying years of buried truth. "I never believed I'd have a place that was mine," she said. "A place where the wind didn't chase me, where fear didn't follow me from one campfire to the next." Luke set down the fence post he'd been working on. He wiped his hands on his jeans and turned fully toward her. "You've got one now," he said simply, quiet but sure. "Right here with me." Nuna lifted her eyes to his. Dark, steady, brave. For the first time, she didn't look like someone preparing to leave. She looked like someone choosing to stay. Her hand brushed his chest just above his heartbeat. "Then I will stay," she whispered. "Not because I must, because I want to." Luke's breath caught before he reached out, cupping her cheek with calloused fingers. "That's all I ever needed." That evening, the sky burned with the colors only the frontier could paint. Deep gold, copper red, and soft violet stretching over endless prairie grass. The air smelled of fresh earth and sage. Nuna stepped onto the porch, Lily in her arms, the baby's dark eyes fluttering open at the warm breeze. Luke followed, wrapping one strong arm around Nuna's shoulders and the other around Lily, pulling both close. None of them spoke. They didn't need to. The land around them, once lonely, once unforgiving, felt like it exhaled, embracing this small, unlikely family. As the sun dipped behind the ridge, a final thought settled over Luke like a vow. Family isn't just the blood you're born into. Out here in the West, it's the people who stand beside you, through hunger and storms, through fear and hope, and choose you again and again. Under the dying light, with Nuna leaning into him and Lily curled against both of them, Luke understood something he never had before. He wasn't alone anymore. And the prairie, wide and wild and endless, finally felt like home.